During the late 1860s, political issues were becoming the heart of social life. Citizens were beginning to become passionately involved with campaigns and domestic matters as tension increased between the Republican North and the Democratic South. The radical Republicans believed that blacks were entitled to the same political rights and opportunities as whites, and the Confederate leaders should be punished for their roles in the Civil War. Many, like Pennsylvania Representative Thaddeus Stevens and Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, fiercely opposed Andrew Johnson's lenient policies. But the radicals felt that extraordinary times called for direct intervention in state affairs and laws designed to protect the emancipated blacks. At the heart of their beliefs was the notion that the blacks must be given an opportunity to compete in a free labor economy. In 1866, this activist Congress also introduced a bill to extend the life of the Freedmen's Bureau and began to work on a civil rights bill. During this time, the Freedmen's Bureau came into play. It provided food, shelter, and medical aid for those made destitute by the war, and it provided over 3,000 black schools and taught over 200,000 blacks to read. During its years of operation, the Freedmen's Bureau fed millions of people, built hospitals, and provided medical aid, negotiated labor contracts for ex-slaves, and settled labor disputes. It also helped former slaves legalize marriages and locate lost relatives, and assisted black veterans. The Bureau was instrumental in building thousands of schools for blacks and helped to found such colleges as Howard University in Washington, D.C., Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, and Hampton University in Hampton, Virginia. The Bureau frequently worked in conjunction with the American Missionary Association and other private organizations. Additionally, the Bureau tried, with little success, to promote land redistribution. However, most of the confiscated or abandoned Confederate land was eventually restored to the original owners, so there was little opportunity for black land ownership, which was seen as means to success in society. Because President Andrew Johnson was pro-South, he strongly opposed the Freedmen's Bureau and even vetoed it at one point. However, Congress overrid the veto and passed the law anyway. The Act of 1866 pronounced all African Americans to be U.S. citizens and provided legal shields against the operation of the Southern states' black codes. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 also represented the first effort of Congress to pass a civil rights bill. The act dealt with citizenship on former slaves, enumerated the civil rights of former slaves, and supplied various methods of enforcement by both executive officials and judges, and also imposed penalties and punishments on officials for failing to perform their duties. The act also reversed the historic status of blacks before the law, in clear and certain terms. At the creation of the Republic, blacks had been dealt an unfair fate. They were not legal people and therefore they had no legal rights. This act offered a promise of a monumental leap forward.
The Black Codes prohibited blacks from buying or renting land. Free men were forced to sign work contracts, and blacks were prohibited from testifying against whites in courts. The restrictive nature of the codes and widespread black resistance to the environment enraged many in the North, who argued that the codes violated the fundamental principles of free labor ideology. After passing the Civil Rights Act over Johnson's veto, Republicans in Congress effectively took control of Reconstruction. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 required Southern states to ratify the 14th Amendment, which granted equal protection of the Constitution to former slaves and enacted universal male suffrage before they could rejoin the Union. The 15th Amendment, adopted in 1870, guaranteed that a citizen's right to vote would not be denied on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. During this period of radical Reconstruction, 1865 through 1877, blacks won election to Southern state governments and even to the U.S. Congress. As indicated by the passage of the Black Codes, however, the white Southerners showed a steadfast commitment to ensuring their supremacy and the survival of plantation agriculture in the post-war years. Support for Reconstruction policy waned after the early 1870s, undermined by the violence of white supremacist organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan. In 1877, when the last federal soldiers left the South and Reconstruction drew to a close, to a close. Blacks had seen little improvements in their economic and social status, and the vigorous efforts of white supremacist forces throughout the region had undone the political gains that they made. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution officially abolished and continues to prohibit slavery to this day. The 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution declared that all persons born or naturalized in the United States are American citizens, including African Americans. The 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution prohibits each government in the United States from denying a citizen the right to vote based on that citizen's race, color, or previous condition. 13th Amendment says I'm free!
Whoa, what is this?
Oh my gosh, I'm a citizen now! I vote Republican! Plessy v. Ferguson was one of the most important debates of all time. Until the mid-20th century, Plessy v. Ferguson gave a constitutional nod to racial segregation in public places, foreclosing legal challenges against increasingly segregated institutions throughout the South. The rail cars in Plessy, notwithstanding the black faculties in these institutions were decidedly inferior to white ones, creating a kind of racial caste society.
Blacks promised if they were to work for and obey the whites must provide blacks with an education. Booker T. Washington was a passive thinker and believed that blacks needed to earn the respect of the whites and work for their positions, whereas W.E.B. Du Bois believed that the blacks did not need to prove anything and should be allowed to have the same position as whites. All wanted to put an end to the Jim Crow laws, and this was known as the Atlanta Compromise.
You know what? I think now that we have our freedom, that we should be able to work and okay. You know what? I think that we should be able to work for the respect that we deserve and work up to the positions that we want to be.
I disagree. We're born with the respect. The Reconstruction Act also divided the South into 5 military districts under commanders empowered to employ the Army to protect black property and citizens. The first 2 years of Congressional Reconstruction saw Southern states rewrite their constitutions and the ratification of the 14th Amendment. Congress seemed fully in control. One thing stood in the way. It was President Johnson himself. Radical leaders employed an extraordinary constitutional remedy to clear the impediment: presidential impeachment. As whites regained power over the South by 1877 and throughout the century that followed, whites from both North and South pilloried the Reconstruction period as a disaster because blacks were in charge and were, by in their interpretation, racially unfit to rule and unprepared for the rights. By discrediting the era in which blacks were most active politically, historians, filmmakers, politicians, and writers from across the country effectively acquitted the white South of defranchising blacks under the Redemption and Jim Crow periods. They permitted racial segregation and discrimination and even sanctioned it for over a century. 1877 ended federal support for Republican South and supported the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. Also, it withdrew the last of the federal troops in the South and protected blacks and Republicans. The Compromise of 1876 effectively dealt with the Reconstruction era. Southern Democrats' promises to protect civil and political rights of blacks were not kept, and at the end of federal interference in Southern affairs led to widespread disfranchisement of black voters. From the late 1870s onward, Southern legislatures passed a series of laws requiring the separation of whites from persons of colors on public transportation in schools, parks, restaurants, theaters, and other locations. They were known as the Jim Crow laws, after a popular minstrel act developed in the antebellum years. These segregationist statutes governed life in the South through the middle of the next century, ending only after the hard-won successes of the civil rights movement in the 1960s.
The Credit Mobilier was a government scandal in which insiders gave stock to influential members of Congress to avoid investigation of profits from the government, subsidies for building the transcontinental railroads. There was a new form of the spoils system in which Ulysses S. Grant, a former war hero, hired his friends into government and caused the Panic of 1873. It showed how corruption tainted the Gilded Age politics and the lengths railroads and other economic interests would go to assure and increase profits.
Hey, we have a new project coming up. We need somebody to build the railroad. And because I have shares in your company, why don't you do it?
Oh yeah, that would be great.
So how much should you get paid?
Like 20,000 maybe?
Wait, but I'll do it for $10,000.
I'm sorry, but we don't need your services.